Katina Michael from Arizona State University, coming to you again from beautiful Surf Beach, Kiama, New South Wales, Australia. Well, at 4 a.m. my time this morning, I had a couple of students in Open Consult time come and talk to me about funding again. And we were inspired by the words of Pat Scannell, who was talking to us about how to position public interest technology projects and how to go about gaining funding. He did say that you're talking to people who understand quantities and dollar figures, and in some way the project would have to be couched in this kind of terminology. And I put it to the students this morning on what they thought, whether the way that we had delivered 502 using the end-to-end design process was actually a good way to look at the problem of a public interest technology project. And we came up with some preliminary sort of discussion that it all, of course, depended on who your client was and who you were talking to. If it was a policymaker, you would use terms that policymakers would understand. If you were talking to a user experience designer, you'd use design terminology. And if you were talking to city council planners, you would talk urban planning or planning per se. Bit of a man for all seasons, and being able to change the way you speak to suit the person and stakeholder you're interacting with. But we kept coming back to this notion of not-for-profits, funding, this term, what is a not-for-profit, and how in some states, particularly in the US, not-for-profits have changed the way that they campaign for their cause. And usually the perception is that a not-for-profit is strapped for cash and resources, but often the methodology that's employed is to have, a big cocktail party, invite your biggest kinds of high society and hope that they will fund the project. Interestingly, we talked about the difference between different types of causes and how animals quite often received huge pots of money for their cause, whether it was endangered species or the recovery and nursing back to wildlife and wild waters of animals. And some of these not-for-profits, in fact all of them, have to publish their statements. Many of them have between maybe $5 and $15 million sitting there as resource for a rainy day, for the potential partnering of a new project. And we came to the conclusion that it's wonderful when donors give money and sort of say, thank you, your cause is wonderful, and they never come back because they trust that the money will be used wisely. And then there are the other kinds of funders that always want to know what's happening with their cash, and that's a bit more complicated. Perhaps they have an imperative. Perhaps they want something to happen. But often we look at not-for-profits, their websites are poor, perhaps. Their engagement strategies are poor. The way they communicate to constituents is poor. But on the flip side, there are not-for-profits that have people at the helm that are dressed in Armani suits and perhaps drive a fast car, and mix it with these high society, big potential funders for the reason of attracting funds and keeping things going, especially on the operational side. And that's a bit interesting as a story, because as we contemplated, it's a bit sort of weird when you walk into a not-for-profit and you see $1,000 chairs or a big board table that costs tens of thousands of dollars. And that's the big question here, is when do we cross over and not try to mimic the commercial sector? And that's a constant challenge. Public interest technology doesn't necessarily mean you're poor and bootstrapped and cash-strapped, but it also doesn't mean that you're using the same strategies that commercial entities use to garner support, especially those cocktail parties. Although there's value in the mixing part of it, but buying a ticket for $100 a pop is pretty unconvincing to a lot of young people today in the way they view the world in the not-for-profit sector and non-government organisation sector. the other discussion I had, and this is something that happened to me early on when I was working in commercial, was what do you do with these big dollar figures? You know, our bank accounts generally don't house six figures all the time. We might be paid a salary that's six figures, but really that's not our bank account. And spending that money, you know, you're very conservative as a citizen to make sure you can pay your electricity bills, your telephone bills, your utilities in general, you know, your rates, your taxes and so forth. But when you're working in the operations part of an NGO and you're seeing these big funders come in with perhaps $1 million support services and support offerings more precisely, well, what do you do with the money? And the question is a good one. We're not used to spending big dollars. We're not used to partnering in big dollars, but it's possibly worth a retreat and at least an afternoon out if your level of engagement means that you're receiving in excess of $10 million in the kitty at the end of the year. Then what do you do with the $10 million? Do you just invest it perhaps in an area that doesn't match your NGO or your not-for-profit? So if you're fighting pollution and the next thing you do is go and work or go and invest in a company that sort of, you know, specializes in creating e-waste, there's a mismatch with your value system. And I've had these discussions in Australia with Australian entrepreneurs who are looking at investment in sustainable areas. That's what they'd love to see, this sustainability cycle. And so if you are making some good money that you can return back to the community, make sure you're investing it in healthy ways, not just for the maximum monetary output. But as givers, as donors, as funders, we have a responsibility when we give our money away. We have to follow through and ask what's happening with it. We have to be good stewards. It's not just blindly giving your money and going, rightio, I trust. Although that sort of blind trust does help an entity actually use the money in appropriate ways without too much fuss. And so the question is whether, you know, we should be sort of creating incentivization schemes where we give away freebie tours or freebies to donors when that time could be used to more productive purposes. It's a very interesting kind of conundrum to have. I mean, one is having the money, having the donors, having these big donors constantly support your services and your offerings as a not-for-profit. The other is what's actually happening to that money, if anything, and is it being just invested? Interestingly, people in the space of non-human not-for-profits don't like to see money thrown at more resources on the operational side, like labor. They'd rather see things returned to the animals and to the sea, for example, or to nature if it's above sea level. So these are just some thoughts. I found them intriguing. We used some good examples there where, again, we discussed micropayments. We even discussed this analogy of tithing. What does that mean? And in the context of not-for-profits, there's micropayments and offerings, how you mobilize a society to give, even if it's at the fractional cent or dollar range. Just some reflections there. Hope they mean something to you if you're watching. Tina Michael from Arizona State University. Boy, I'm enjoying these wonderful exchanges with our wonderful students in the PIT program. Hope you can join us in the future. Signing off.